So on behalf of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, welcome to this evening's Generally Speaking program. I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the museum. As some of you watching may know by now, we launched a season of Generally Speaking this summer in order to explore the experiences of 3Gs, or grandchildren of survivors, and how trauma and memory and legacy are passed down through the experience of being a 3G. So we've had great conversations with Alyssa Greengrass Summer and David Wax, with David Slucky, Joshua Foer, and Ben Cohen, and all of them are on the museum's YouTube channel. We encourage you to check them out. Tonight, we are delighted to have our special guest, Beth Kean, CEO of Holocaust Museum Los Angeles. And we're going to wrap up the season with a sort of season finale in January with a really interesting Jewish athletic story. Through it all, we've had our wonderful host, Stephanie Butnick, deputy editor at Tablet Magazine and host of the Unorthodox podcast. So Beth is a 3G with an impressive career in finance and nonprofit leadership. She was on the board of Holocaust Museum Los Angeles for 10 years before becoming CEO in 2017, a role in which she's overseen many large initiatives, including most recently a rebranding of the museum. Beth brings a powerful personal perspective to her work overseeing the nation's oldest Holocaust museum, and we're delighted to have her with us. Before we get started, just a quick note that the Zoom chat and Q&A boxes are open, so please feel free to share comments and questions throughout the program, and Stephanie and Beth will get to as many as they can. Without further ado, welcome Stephanie and Beth.
Ari, thank you so much, and thank you to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for having me as the moderator for this wonderful series, and to Beth Kean, thank you for being here with me tonight.
Thank you, I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Stephanie, Ari, Museum of Jewish Heritage, because you know my roots are in New York. So, and I have a lot of friends and family I see in the chat room.
I know, I see your last name is like popping up several times. So your squad has assembled here, which is impressive.
They show up.
Yes, as they should. So Beth, it's really a treat to be here with you. When we first spoke, when we first met via Zoom a few weeks back, you bragged that you were the oldest 3G, third generation. Oh, sorry, my cat. Hold on. I'm going to mute myself. Hold on. Sorry. My cat has a bit of a respiratory, he's like a little bit of a cold. That was gross. I'm sorry. Anyway, my punchline, when we met, you bragged about being the oldest 3G, so the oldest grandchild of Holocaust survivors. So can you back up that claim? I won't like make you show your ID or anything.
Okay, so I do have a trophy in my office that was given to me by my staff that says oldest 3G. And I guess it's really the only time that I'll ever brag about my age right now, about how old I am. Okay, so I'm 53 years old, and my grandparents were 40 and 43 when I was born. And my mom was born in 1947 after the war. And I haven't found a 3G older than myself. And we have a running joke on the staff because anytime they meet a 3G at an event, and if they look, if like they're around 50-ish, they try to find a way to politely find out their age in a very polite, subtle way. And they never end up to be older than me. So I think that is something very unique about me being a 3G, because I got to be an adult with my grandparents. I got to really engage with them on a very deep level. And, I had formative years with them where they were very young and active grandparents. I played tennis with my grandfather. I went on vacation with them. We went to Mexico together. So so being the oldest 3G is my claim to fame.
Well, that is amazing. We're here with royalty. We did not know. We're here with 3G royalty, and that is very exciting. So, something we usually talk about is this idea that 3Gs often meet their grandparents when they are older, later in their lives. That's obviously not the case for you, but something we sort of talk about a lot is this idea that, like, by the time you've had grandchildren, you've softened a bit, maybe the sort of the immediate post-war experience is behind you, the war experience as well, right? What you have been through is sort of far enough behind you. You have it a little bit different, but I'm curious if you could tell us, I always start these events by asking, sort of saying, like, when did you realize that your family was just not quite like everyone else's family? And you knew these people, you knew your survivor grandparents when they were young people. I'm just so curious how your experience tracks.
So I think, I remember that from a very young age. I remember that there was just something very sad and painful that happened to my grandparents' families. That is, from a very early memory. I just remember, this pain, and this heavy burden that they carried. And I knew my grandmother had a tattoo on her arm, and I knew it was related to that. And I knew that they did not have any real family. Our family, my like aunts and uncles were not through blood. It was other survivor families who they had become very close to. So I always knew at a very young age that something bad had happened and they lost their parents and grandparents and siblings, but I didn't understand that it was the Holocaust. But that was from, a very young age. And my grandmother would talk about, she would tell us stories about being hungry and some of the suffering, but we kind of had to piece it together until I was old enough to really understand what it really meant. So it's really that I knew that this, this suffering had existed. They experienced something really, really bad, and I always tried to want to figure out what exactly it was.
And so when did this idea of, the Holocaust, when did that sort of understanding come that this sort of amorphous bad thing that had happened to them was actually this very significant historical event that was, far larger than just, your own grandparents?
Yeah, it was definitely, I would say definitely by the age of 10, I knew about the Holocaust. And, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. We celebrated Shabbat dinners together. My sister and I slept at their house a lot. And, my grandmother suffered from having nightmares. And, as a young child, I would, hear her sometimes screaming at night. But when you're a kid, you don't really understand the meaning behind that. I felt bad and terrible, but I didn't really understand the enormity of the Holocaust, even though my grandparents showed their pain in different ways. And then I guess it must have been around 10 or 11 when I started learning about it. And then since I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, my grandmother talked about it a lot, and I asked her a lot of questions. And I think it is a lot easier for survivors to talk to their grandchildren. I mean, look, as we know, you're a fellow 3G. Grandparents were the golden children, right? They just showered us with attention and with so much love. And we are not supposed to be here. So we're it's a miracle to our grandparents, that we exist. And so my grandmother, I just have these memories sitting around the kitchen table. She was an amazing cook and baker, and she was always in the kitchen. And I just have these memories of sitting around the kitchen table and hearing stories about her in the camp. She peeled potatoes. So I heard over and over again how she was one of the lucky ones because she had the coveted job of working in the kitchen at this all women's concentration camp called Ravensbrück. She didn't share the details. I just knew that she peeled potatoes, and that saved her life because she would say the Nazis were stupid. They didn't know that, all the nutrients were in the skins, and she was able to hoard them back to the barracks and give them to her sister and sneak them in for herself. And she even tossed them across the floor to fellow prisoners who would walk through the kitchen.
So how did you find out? I mean, I know you're finding out these sort of small bits from your grandmother. I mean, was there a point at which you set out to trace their whole story or to chronicle, before obviously you get to the point of running a wonderful Holocaust museum out in LA, what was that piecing together of that story from anecdotes to basically, history like?
So another memory that I do have is my grandfather always looking through the phone book. He was obsessed with finding relatives. And, that's just like all these things that I'm telling you, just for me, it was normal. I mean, it was just like a normal part of my childhood. And, he would go through the phone book and he would look for relatives. Anytime they traveled to another city, he would pick up the phone book and look for relatives. And, it was a compulsion of his. And then, when the internet came, he would scour the internet for relatives. And actually, the year he died, he discovered a first cousin in Sweden. So I think that this is something that, children and grandchildren, great grandchildren of survivors, always trying to fill in the pieces of the puzzle. This will be forever right now. So, that was something my grandfather trying to find relatives who are alive. And right before he died, he finds a first cousin in Sweden. And now, we lost touch because my mom and I didn't really understand that connection until years later. A couple of years ago, we were on a family heritage trip to Poland over the summer, and we discovered, my mother discovered her second cousins, and it was through this family in Sweden. So it was a complete coincidence. These second cousins happened to be on our trip, our family heritage trip to Poland. And we now do Zoom chats every couple of weeks. And these second cousins live in Detroit, but the other second cousins, live in Sweden. And so through them, we're, learning other information about that is on my grandfather's side of the family. But that is something that I remember, just being obsessed with trying to find family members. And I remember even at one point, my grandmother in the 80s found relatives in Canada. And I mean, that's just, it's shocking news to anyone. But when you grow up, knowing about something your whole life, it doesn't seem so shocking when it happens.
It's so interesting because you have this really unusual experience. The people I've been talking to, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents are here on this Zoom. They are amazing. Cecile and Al Rothas, my father's parents, who were Holocaust survivors, passed away when I was about 3 or 4 in like 1990. And so I actually don't know them. My version of them is the stories I've pieced together, secondhand that they've told, and these sort of like heroic tales of being young and then like being sort of old at the end of their lives. I mean, it's really, and I barely remember that, right? It's sort of like grainy VHS footage at this point, but it's kind of amazing that you actually got to meet your grandparents and see them as people, right? You know the stories of them being young and in the camps, and you know about the lives they restarted. So I'm so curious if you could tell me how that relationship with them progressed throughout your life.
So I got to watch Schindler's List with my grandfather. I mean, when did that movie come out? In the early 90s, 92, 93? I graduated from college in 1989. So my grandparents got to experience all of these amazing milestones with me. They were at my bat mitzvah in 1980. They came to my college graduation in 1989. I went to the movie theater to see Schindler's List with my grandfather. And I remember walking out of the theater, and it was hard for me to even take a breath because it was so emotional. And he just looked at me and said, "I wish I had been in that camp."
Sanitized theatrical version of it.
Right. But my grandfather, he was a very positive person. He loved telling jokes. I always wondered, I knew that they were robbed of their teenage years because when the war started, my grandmother she was born in 27. So she was 12, 13 years old. And my grandfather was like 16 years old. So they were robbed of their teenage years. They were robbed of an education. And, then they it's amazing when you see the life that they built for themselves after the war and so quickly. So I was always, I mean, even from a young age, just so enamored with their strength and resilience and, and their perseverance. But my grandfather, he loved to tell Polish jokes, and he always, wanted to laugh. And so he never talked about anything about the Holocaust. He never really talked about being in the camps. And it wasn't until years later, when my husband was working on his film called Swimming in Auschwitz. Yes, I will plug my husband's film. I know he's watching. um, and he was doing research on his film, and I had to ask my grandfather about um, camp brothers and sisters and what, if he experienced that. And then my grandfather, all of a sudden, he started opening up, because that was something that made him feel human. That was something that was, he was able to talk about. And I realized he didn't like focusing on the pain and the suffering, but once he could talk about being human in the camps, then all of a sudden the floodgates opened. And then we started learning about stories from him. And then my grandmother, she, just growing up, she loved to cook, she loved to bake, and unfortunately it skipped 2 generations and went straight to my daughter, who loves being in the kitchen, and made my grandmother's marble cake recipe. She's the first person, since my grandmother died, who made this amazing marble cake that it's like impossible to make. But I, have these memories of her, just as soon as you walked into the house, it just always smelled like something was in the oven baking. But I have to say that whenever I did spend time with my grandmother, there was always some story about being in the camps, because it was always a reminder. And looking back, now that I'm working full time, in this space, I realized, like, she was basically reliving her trauma all the time. But for her, it must have been cathartic, to share these stories. And, I looking back, I know, I wish I had known at the time how brave she was when she was telling me these stories. But when you're a child and you're listening to your grandparent tell you stories, even though they were 40 years older than me, they're still old to me, right? And so you don't imagine your grandparents as teenagers being young and taking risks, and doing things, that knowing that they could get killed for it. So
You start in New York, the grandchild of survivors. Where you are right now is that you run the LA Museum of the Holocaust. So take me along the journey to get there. Because I imagine when you were younger, you didn't think, when I grow up, I'm going to run a Holocaust museum.
Doesn't everyone want to grow up to run a Holocaust museum? I did not take a linear path to this role. I worked on Wall Street right after college, and then I fell in love with someone who worked in the entertainment business, which meant I had to move to Los Angeles. And so I moved to LA in 1997 and worked for a large investment firm. And when I moved to LA, because my roots are in New York and I was so close to my grandparents, I immediately felt this void in my life because I was disconnected to the survivor community. And so my husband was doing research on his film, and he would go to the museum and come home every day and say to me, he was doing research at the museum, and he would come home and say, you have to go to the Holocaust Museum, your people are there. And I listened to him say this for a while until finally I took him up on his offer to join him for a visit. And I showed up at the museum and I met the survivors and I heard their thick Polish accents, which felt so familiar. And I joke around that, I showed up and I basically never left. And I joined the board, and then I became treasurer of the board, and I helped us through the first capital campaign to build our existing building that we're in today. And that led to being board chair that eventually led me to the CEO role. So that's how I got here. And I think it's kind of funny because when the museum first opened in 2010, it was a big deal because the survivors, we were always in rented spaces, and we have this really large collection of artifacts. And just to back up a little bit, Ari mentioned in the introduction that we're the oldest Holocaust museum in the country. And in fact, it's a really interesting story that I like to share. But survivors met at Hollywood High School in 1961, taking an English class, and they decided they wanted to create a safe space where they could remember their family members who perished in the Holocaust, and showcase their precious artifacts and start educating young people about what happened. And they never wanted to turn anyone away from learning about this history. So fast forward all these years, we continue to honor their wishes and don't charge admission. But in the mid 2000s, they started getting really worried about whether the museum would be around forever. And so that's why it was really important to build a permanent home. So my husband and I were on the board and played a really big role in that capital campaign and making it happen.
I will say that people in the comments are saying that your husband's film Swimming in Auschwitz is amazing, is wonderful is what they're saying. And then someone else is saying that we should all make sure to catch his film After Auschwitz, which is a must see as well. So this is a family affair. So I'm just going to sort of, questions are coming in. We're going to just intersperse them with mine. We're all family here. These are your people, it sounds like, Beth. So someone's asking basically which side of your family this was, how they got here, sort of some of the backstory.
Okay, so these are my mother's parents, and so I'll share a little bit about what actually happened to my grandparents, because it is really a miracle that I am here. And I think that it's also important to share that I feel like grandchildren are wired a certain way. Grandchildren of survivors are wired a certain way. And you'll see this when you have kids, that my kids, when they were younger, like our bedtime reading was like Anne Frank, but at a very young age before middle school. And also there was this book, How We Survived, that was written by child survivors of the Holocaust. And it had like short personal stories, and that was their bedtime reading.
So you're starting them young.
So we started at a very young age. But my mother was born in a DP camp right after the war in January of 47. And my grandparents, they actually met right after the war. My grandmother was in Ravensbrück, which is north of Berlin, and she had to make her way back to Sosnowiec, Poland, which is where she was from, which is southwest Poland, not too far from Auschwitz on the German border. And it took her a really long time to get home, but a lot of people went back home just to see who survived. And my grandfather also went back, and they met right away and got married. They fell in love, and they didn't know each other before the war, and made their way to the DP camp, which is right outside of Munich. And my mom was born there, and they met their best friends, Mary and Lou Organ, who's I think their grandkids are also watching right now, and their daughter. I see she's on the chat. Anyway, they became best friends because this is a great story. My grandfather needed a carriage for my mother when she was born, and Lou was, I guess that's when they met. He was, in the DP camp, everyone had a job and everyone was working. It was like a mini, community that they had created. And so that's where he met his best friend. And when they went to New York, eventually, he and Lou started a furniture manufacturing company for hair salons. And they were in business together until they retired. So that's what I mean also when, my mother, we don't really have blood relatives on my mother's side, but all of our close relatives are Jewish aunts and uncles, um, who are also survivors.
I am really obsessed with the DP camps, the displaced persons camps. My grandparents met in the DP camp at Bergen-Belsen, which I told you. I mean,
Yeah.
they got married there. They were part of the theater troupe, and the theater troupe traveled to Paris to perform. And I think we think of this idea of like liberation. Oh, the camps are liberated, the war ends, and then everyone, I guess, ends up in America. But like what actually happened was a lot of people stayed in Europe. I mean, you had to piece together your life again. And I think that like strange post-war liminal space is really, really fascinating to me. And like that's where your mother, I mean, this idea of like a baby stroller in a displaced persons camp, I mean, they must have been so happy.
Oh, can we show the photo of Ari, please, of my mom in the DP camp? So those are my grandparents. I just love this photo. I mean, look how, and what, this is just 2 years after the war. My mom was a fat baby, and my grandmother was very proud about that.
That has like even more meaning than typically when, mothers want,
Right, right. And this is the carriage where my grandfather met his best friend.
And
So,
who would have thought you guys would be in a Zoom together all these years later?
right, exactly. My grandparents would never imagine in a million years. And this is them also in the DP camp. So I do have to give my husband's film After Auschwitz a shout out, because what you just talked about, how did people move on after the war and what was it like at liberation? After Auschwitz starts at liberation, and everyone thinks that when the survivors were liberated, that must have been the happiest day of their lives. But in fact, it was like one of the scariest, because what is liberation? What does freedom mean when you have no home and no family to go back to? So, what amazes me is that, while it was scary and they experience, I mean, such horrors and things that we can never imagine, that they were able to rebuild so fast. I mean, the fact that so quickly they created these displaced persons camps and were able to find love and get married and have babies, and like your family, being born in Bergen-Belsen, there were a lot of babies born there after the war. I mean, it just speaks volumes about, their resiliency.
I mean, it's crazy. Like my grandparents' crew of people were basically the Bergen-Belsen crew, and then some survivors they met in Queens, also where your,
Yeah.
came. I think it's so interesting that how when you move to New York, say, it does make sense that your closest people, your family, really are people who experience this horrible thing that even Jews in America probably couldn't really relate to on so many levels.
Yeah, I do have to give a shout out to Mike Alpert, because he is a survivor that I know is watching right now. And he was, speaking of, our grandparents being friends with survivors, Mike and his wife Darlene were very, very close friends of my grandparents. They were neighbors in Flushing, Queens. And I know that he's watching right now from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So he's really our last connection to my grandparents. So that's also, something that's getting to be very hard right now, is how all these questions that we have, and that we didn't ask our parents or our grandparents, their friends who are still alive, they were, it's that last living connection for us that just means so much.
So speaking of connections, your old friend Deborah wants to know, sort of if it was different with your grandparents sharing with you versus sharing with your mother. I mean, was that relationship different? Was the amount they shared different?
Yeah, because my mother, she just wanted to be normal. She wanted to assimilate. She, just wanted to be an American girl, and she had to live with their trauma. My sister and I have a younger sister. We we're, you know, one generation separated. So we didn't have that trauma, you know, so it was a very different kind of relationship. And I think it was just, um, I think it was kind of a relief for my grandparents, especially my grandmother, who really wasn't shy about talking about her experiences. Um, I think, you know, and that's just from talking to other 3Gs and 2Gs, that seems to be very common, that, you know, once the grandchildren came along, you know, that's when survivors could open up. And, you know, because they wanted their own kids to just try to be as normal as possible, whatever, you know, that normal meant, right? Like
Yeah.
my uncle is 5 years younger than my mother, and he was born in the United States. So the fact that my grandparents had a child born in America, that was huge. That, you know, meant so much to them.
Sorry, I have to get my cat out of the frame. He's really into this conversation and wants to be more a part of it. So it seems like, you know, someone's asking, it seems like some people, well, so something I've learned actually first, is that the 3Gs actually want the stories, right? Either because they didn't get the firsthand connection, you know, their grandparents weren't around, maybe their grandparents still didn't talk about it. I mean, they sort of went on these trips back to the old country and to find out their stories. And then they basically, make these stories their own. And so it's so interesting for me to talk to you, because you were in so many ways doing that, right? You are in Los Angeles, you are running, as we said, the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. I mean, how have you sort of made this your own? And then of course, I want to ask you about, you know, what it means to turn Holocaust remembrance into a profession, right? Like something that has been so much a part of your life. What does it mean to like go into the office and do that?
It's truly a gift, I have to say. I feel like the work that I'm doing is so gratifying and rewarding, and you know, I feel this sense of responsibility now that my grandparents are no longer here. You know, I have to preserve their legacy. You know, now that we're moving further away from this history, you know, memories fade. And so I feel this big responsibility now, you know, to tell their stories. I feel like we're now stewards of this history. And, uh, you know, it's something that I take very seriously. And there's actually a space in the museum in one of the galleries that's dedicated to my grandparents. And Ari, I was wondering if you can share the photo of like all the grandkids and the great grandkids.
The Kinderlach?
Yeah, that one. Okay, so there's actually a gallery in the museum that's in memory of Rose and Arnold Rakashinsky, my grandparents' name. And these are my kids and my sister's kids. My husband and I are on the right side. My sister and her husband are on the left. And then all the great grandkids are in this photo underneath the dedication to my grandparents. So, you know, this to me, this is like the biggest revenge right here. And, you know, it was just such a proud moment to be able to take this photo, you know, underneath my grandparents' name. But you know, when I'm at the museum, right now the museum's closed, but when I'm there normally, and I'm walking through or giving tours, and I get to that room and I feel so, sometimes I get emotional, sometimes I don't. I don't know why that is, but it's a really proud moment when I get to that gallery and I get to, you know, share with people. And this room is dedicated to my grandparents, because that dedication actually happened after they had already passed away. So I know, I always think like, what would they have thought that like tens of thousands of people visit this museum and get to see Arnold and Rose Rakashinsky? It's, you know, and I tell their stories, you know.
They would have said, "Are you sure you want to leave finance?" Just kidding.
Well, I think my very first job though at the museum was cleaning headsets with disinfectant wipes. So I really did move my way up the ladder.
That's amazing. I'm picturing now your dad looking up the name Rakoshinsky in the phone books. That gives me a little more context. Is every Rakoshinsky related to, like, that they would you ever find one that was not at all related?
So I don't think we've found a Rakoshinsky that was, we have found, I mean, so this is how we actually got reconnected, or connected, I should say, with our second cousins, because Jeffrey Simbler, who is, I think he's very active with the Museum of Jewish Heritage. He does a lot of genealogy work. I think it was Jeffrey, who posted a picture of a tombstone from the cemetery in Sosnovitz, where my grandparents were from, and it had Rakoshinsky on the tombstone with this other name that said Storchin. And he said, he tagged me and my mom and said, you guys are related. And so we knew somehow we were related to the Storchin family because of this tombstone. And we started doing research, and then it was that summer where we met the Storchin family on our family heritage trip. So it really all started, this connection started from seeing the name Rakoshinsky on a tombstone. And then recently, Jeffrey sent something else to me and my mom on Facebook, a document that was found when a property was sold that had the Rakoshinsky name, for a piece of property in Sosnovitz recently. And it is such an unusual name that if you're from that area in Poland with that last name, then you have to be related. So now my mom and I are trying to figure out, well, how are we related to this family now?
So will you tell us a little bit more about the LA Museum of the Holocaust? I mean, you've described its inception. I mean, could you tell us some of the exhibits, what we could sort of find, when this is all over and we can all go visit it, or what the virtual offerings are? Just give us sort of a taste of what you offer.
Yeah. So we launched a new brand during the pandemic. And so we're at Holocaust Museum LA, and we have a new logo. I'm going to show my mask with the hand. And so our museum tells the story of the Holocaust through primary sources and oral histories. So when you visit the museum, it's more of a visual museum with a rich collection of artifacts. And what makes it unusual is most of our artifacts were actually donated by survivors who settled in Los Angeles after the war, and their families. And so when you learn about this history in our museum, you're really learning about it through the lens of the survivors. But we also do have some artifacts that are on loan from the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. And what I love about those artifacts is that, I mean, for me personally, those artifacts represent people whose names we'll never know. So it's a way for us to honor, the millions of people who perished there, who don't have a name. We just don't know their name, but it represents the individual. Objects like a little girl's dress, or a children's shoe, or a kiddish cup, or a makeup compact. And it shows you, by looking at these artifacts, it shows you, the deception that was forced upon them. Because, like, why would you bring a makeup compact, on a train to Auschwitz? You're thinking you want to look pretty when you get off the train, right? They had no idea where they were going. So I think it's nice that we're able to honor, those people through those objects. But it's a beautiful museum architecturally. It's subterranean. We're on public land. I think we're the only Holocaust museum in the country on public land. And we have a 50-year land lease with the city for $1 a year. It was designed deliberately to evoke emotion as you're walking through. So the next time people are in Los Angeles, please look me up and I'd be happy to give you a tour of the museum. We're also doing a ton of virtual programming right now, just like Museum of Jewish Heritage. 2 to 4 programs a week, including a survivor speaker. Sometimes we do it in different languages. I think we have a Hebrew one coming up, but we quickly pivoted to, this virtual platform. And And, we're really proud of the programs that we've been hosting. And one of the things that we started recently is a monthly series called Building Bridges. And that was a response to the death of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer. We decided it was really important to bring leaders from different communities together for a conversation. So we have a leader from the African American community, Hispanic, Jewish, and Asian, American Asian. And once a month, we meet, and one of our board members, Dan Schnur, who's a political strategist, is the moderator. And the other thing is our student tours, which is so important. And now we're reaching out to more students than we did before the pandemic. So I think that, there are some silver linings to the pandemic. I think it's important. A lot of museums, like the Museum of Jewish Heritage and our museum, and other Holocaust museums around the country, are collaborating more than ever before, which is really nice, because I think it's really important to amplify our impact by, working together.
So someone's asking what the curriculum looks like for students. I know you sort of just mentioned that high school program. Is there like Holocaust requirements? What does it look like there?
Okay, I do want to clarify, Ari, thank you for pointing out Museum of Jewish Heritage is also on public land. Okay, owned by New York State. Good to know.
There's gonna be a rumble after this.
Okay, all right. So Holocaust education is mandated by the state. So we follow the state curriculum. However, I think Holocaust education is only mandated by, I think, 12 or 13 states. But they don't teach you, there are no guidelines for how to teach it, really. Even though they have a curriculum, the teachers don't get trained. And so we're finding that, it's a really difficult subject matter. So some teachers will spend a day on it. Some teachers will spend half a day. Some will spend multiple days. So one of the things that we're doing is really trying to expand our teacher trainings. And now that, it's so easy to do that in this virtual platform, that, that's been really helpful. Did that answer the question?
Yes,
Oh.
it definitely did. But it sounds like what you're saying is that it's required, but what you're doing is helping to make sure teachers have the resources they need to not just like show Schindler's List and call it a day.
Yeah, so we work really closely with the teachers, and we also we have lots of different types of programs depending on the students and the school. So we customize a lot of the student tours depending on age and how much they know. And most of the students are from low-income communities and 99% not Jewish. It's probably 70% Title I schools.
So someone wants to know a bit more about your trip back to Sosnovich and what it was like for you.
Oh, it was really life-changing. So the first trip I did was with my parents and my sister. And then the second trip was with my mother and my daughter, who was 19 at the time, and my nephew, who was 17.
4Gs, the fourth generation.
Yes, fourth, exactly. And that trip was amazing because that's where we met our second cousins, but also we went to my grandfather's apartment where he lived until, 1939, until the age of 16. And we knocked on the door and a young man answered the door and he was wearing a Santa Monica t-shirt. So it was very funny. And he spoke English and we told him that we were actually from Santa Monica and he let us inside the apartment. It's pretty amazing that, the apartment is still standing, except there was a sex shop on the bottom floor. But I know at one time it was a very nice, busy part of the city. So we got to walk through the apartment, and it was emotional for my mother because we stood in the kitchen there was a balcony that looked onto the courtyard, and my grandfather talked about playing soccer in the courtyard with his friends and how his mother used to always call him, scream out from that balcony to come inside for dinner. So my mom got to stand on that balcony and that looked out onto the courtyard. So that was a really special experience. And we just walked through the town, after hearing stories about my grandfather talking about going to the market that was right down the street, and the synagogue that was around the corner, which no longer exists, but just walking, knowing that we were walking in his footsteps all these years later. And then something that we did that was really emotional, we gathered at the roundup in July of 1942. There was a roundup at the soccer field, and we gathered there, and we had a really special ceremony, and we all of us, the entire trip, everyone who was on the trip, and these were people from all over the world, everyone who had family from this same town. And this was a roundup site where they collected everyone from the Sosnovitz ghetto and put them into 4 different lines, and the line to work, the line to go to the train to Auschwitz, and we all walked from there to the train station. So again, that was the same walk that we know many of our relatives had done. Anyway, I get emotional just thinking about it. But we sang this song that they sang to the train station, and then and we had a ceremony there, and we laid a plaque. But I have to say that the mayor of the town and all the people that we met, the fact that they were installing a plaque in memory of our families, and that this dedication was so important to them, that made us feel so good. So there's a plaque now at the roundup site, there's a plaque at the train station. So that was really nice.
That's amazing. And we have Dan in the comments who said he met you on that trip, and it was amazing. It was really
I
special.
love Dan. Hi, Dan. We had a good time. Lots of long bus rides together.
There's a really interesting question from Anthony speaking, in terms of memorializing, right? Like that plaque there. I mean, what do you think is the future of Holocaust memory, which is such a funny phrasing, right? But like, how do you imagine, where do you see your museum, Holocaust museums in 50 years, say, like, and where do you see, how do you see us continuing these sort of initiatives going into the future?
Yeah, that's something that we think about a lot. Forget about like 50 years from now, what about 10 years from now when there are no longer any survivors? How the people who are sharing the firsthand accounts, when they're no longer here, how are we going to, share this history? That's why it's so important right now. Every program that we have is centered around having a dialogue with a survivor, no matter what the program is, because while they're alive and while we have them, it's so important to make sure that the last generation of students has that opportunity to meet with a survivor. So every program is centered around, meeting and having dialogue with a survivor and hearing their story firsthand. So capturing those stories right now, continuing to capture them and document them is really, really important. I know there's a lot of different ways of using technology right now. Through Shoah Foundation has their, Dimensions in Testimony program, where they're creating holographic images of survivors. We have one that's being installed as we speak in our museum. That means that you can have a conversation in real time with a virtual survivor. That doesn't replace the real person, obviously, but it's just another way of being able to, hold on to these stories and preserve these stories. But yeah, that's something that, we're thinking about all the time. How are we going to continue? We have a huge job ahead of us, and we need to do a better job of educating. There's a lot of hate right now in the world, and we're living in a really polarizing climate. And it's really important, we know, to start educating at a very young age. And we need to get more states to mandate, Holocaust education, that it must be mandated in all 50 states.
And it seems like while you're looking to the future, you're really focused on the present as well. You're celebrating a lot of survivor birthdays this week, right?
Yeah, so we have one of our survivors, Gabriella Karen, who speaks at the museum frequently and now virtually. She turned 90 today. Today is her birthday, and we surprised her at her house yesterday, rang her doorbell, and we were outside with our masks on celebrating. And then another one of our survivors, Joe Alexander, turns 98 on Friday. He's also a frequent speaker. And believe it or not, when the pandemic started, we provided computer equipment to all of our survivor speakers just to make sure that they can continue to tell their stories digitally. So they are not shy about when it comes to technology, which is amazing.
I love that. I mean, I also love this idea that you found your people and you continue to have it. These are the people you really connect with most, it feels like. There's something so intimate there between you and survivors.
I think, I think it's also this connection. I feel like they're my connection to my grandparents. I was so fond of my grandparents and I love them so much. And I just feel like I learned so much from the survivors that I heard one really moving story that a survivor at our museum, this woman, Mary Bauer, she was in the same concentration camp as my grandmother. So this is why the connection to the survivors, even in LA, means so much to me. 10 years ago when the museum opened, I was walking through, and one of the objects we had from Auschwitz, Birkenau, was a potato peeler. And so I stopped to look at the potato peeler in the case, knowing that my grandmother peeled potatoes in Ravensbrück. And I was with Mary, and I just stopped and I said, "Oh, wow, look at this, like a potato peeler." And I tell her the story of my grandmother. And she turns to me and she grabs my hands and says, "Beth, darling, your grandmother saved my life." And I looked at her kind of confused, like, "What are you talking about? Like, you didn't know her. She lived in New York. You're here. What is?" And she said, "No, I was in Ravensbrück. I remember all the girls in the kitchen, and they used to toss the skins across the floor. And when we walked by, we would pick them up." And I thought, wow, like I heard that story my whole life from my grandmother, saying how she used to like peel and toss and then sneak them in her mouth. And here, all these years later, Mary is telling me she benefited, and she was probably standing there today because of, my grandmother's brave action, of tossing the skin. So
that's amazing.
Yeah. So I think it's, even though, she probably never knew my grandmother, and it's this connection to my grandparents, and that's so special.
So I'm curious about, your children now before we let you go for the evening. And it's evening here. It's just like afternoon there for you. But I know you actually did miss an event that you guys were doing at the Holocaust Museum of LA today. So thank you, first of all, for missing your event to come to ours. How do your children feel about all this? I mean, they must know how important it is to you. Are they taking on these things in their own way at all?
So my kids, my son, when he was very young, I don't know, maybe like 10 years old, he said something like, "I know we're special." And I looked at him like, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, we're not supposed to be here." And I realized that, like, he just, again, it's not like he had any formal Holocaust education at that point. It was just from, the books that I was, had read him. He knew my grandparents, because my kids were 5 and 7 when my grandparents passed away. So they do have memories of my grandparents, but he just knew, that's what I mean. Like, we're wired a certain way. So he just knew, like, we're really not, it's a miracle that we're here. And so therefore, we have to tell their stories. And, we can't, we, in our house, you can't say I'm starving. If I say I'm starving, my kids are like, you're not starving. You don't know what it's like to be starving. And it's okay to laugh about it. It's fine to, but I do think that they realize they also have an important, responsibility being stewards of this history, and they know what it means, the importance of it. So
That's amazing to hear and not at all surprising, right? And Beth Kean, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your work with Holocaust Museum LA and for sharing your story tonight. And thank you to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. All of it's on public land, both museums. And I'm glad we could do this collaboration tonight.
well, thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation, and it was so nice to see my friends and family in the chat room. Thanks everyone for the support. Thanks to the museum for having me here. It really meant a lot. And thanks, Ari, for all of your help. And Stephanie, you're a great moderator. Thank you.
And on behalf of our museum, to everyone watching and our friends in LA, and to you, Beth, thank you so much for tuning in, and to our always wonderful host, Stephanie. As I mentioned, the last session of this Generally Speaking series is going to take place in January, so make sure to tune in. All of our programs on our museum's website. So I just dropped Museum of Jewish Heritage and Holocaust Museum LA's links in the chat. Both of our work is funded by donors and community members who make all of it possible. So we appreciate your support. We appreciate you tuning in, and we appreciate all of you playing your part in sharing the stories that can't be forgotten. Beth and Stephanie, thank you again, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.